Mark, on that note, let's bring you in because, of course, you've been reporting on this from the angle of, in particular, cities, but also looking at the dynamics of this globalist agenda. Welcome, and what have you got for us today?
Well, Brian, this past Wednesday, RFK Jr.'s Children's Health Defense, CHD TV, put on a program called Break the Silence, the UN's One World Government and the WHO's One Health Agenda. And one of the broad themes that was carried out in this, and I wasn't able to cover the whole thing, but I did pick up on a couple key speakers. One of the broad themes was, while they're worried about the vaccination regime, while they're worried about medical tyranny, they're really concerned about the overarching political tyranny that's needed to enforce medical tyranny. So therefore, ceding power or delegating power to the UN and the WHO was roundly criticized. And this is a list of the speakers. The two I covered were Sabelo Sabanda of South Africa and Dr. Astrid Stuckelberger of Switzerland. And the narrative here at the beginning is, what if the UN and the WHO are being used to build a technocratic government over our world where we lose the right to free speech and decision-making? This week, join an empowering online event cleverly countering two things: countering the UN Summit of the Future and countering the WHO's One Health Congress, both of which start today in terms of their preliminary programs. Our Power to the People Summit include informative strategies on how we can take back our freedoms from unelected globalist agendas and their accomplices nationally. And we'll move on from there. This was shown this past Monday on UK Column, Summit of the Future. And as it indicates, the action days, the startup stuff starts as of today. The whole thing runs through September 23rd, counting the summit itself. We'll move on. And this is the other plank, the One Health World Congress, as noted, starts today, Cape Town, South Africa. And it includes, of course, the WHO, the UN Environmental Program, and two other UN-related entities. And so everything is really kicking off. But one thing I've learned as I covered this was they seem to be falling behind a bit on achieving the Sustainable Development Goals and some other matters. The One Health Congress starting today in South Africa. I could get into a lot of it. This is just shown that people can look it up later to read more details. But anyway, the bottom part says that this builds on the success of the 7th World One Health Congress that was held back in 2022 in Singapore. And therefore, this year's event will bring together One Health stakeholders, ranging from science researchers, policymakers, representatives of international institutions, civil society, et cetera, from the private sector around the world. And one of the things left out of this, of course, is the general public. And the presenters at the Children's Health Defense program took issue with that. And we'll continue to describe what went down at that program. Sabelo Sabanda here, he had a lot to say. He's a lawyer and advocate of the High Court of South Africa. And he notably has worked with the UN's Indigenous Peoples Council. The photos from this event are all original screenshots by me. He addressed the Declaration on Future Generations, which is an offshoot of the Summit of the Future that I mentioned, as this slide shows. And this is the most recent version of the Declaration on Future Generations. And these first three planks, Brian, kind of lay the groundwork for what this is all about. And I put the link with this, and that'll be in the show notes so people can read the whole thing if they want to. But these first three planks are very fundamental. We, the heads of state and government and high representatives, having met at the Summit of the Future at the UN headquarters on 22 and 23 September 2024. That's coming up, of course. They're looking ahead. Reaffirming our commitments to the purposes and principles of the Charter of the UN, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as well as our respective obligations, they say, under international law, and also reaffirming our commitments to the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, including the 2023 SDG Summit Political Declaration, and our pledge to future generations as set out inter alia in the Rio Declaration on Environment and Development. So the mention there, Brian, of the Charter of the UN and the other entity, the other UN documents, one thing that needs to be mentioned really clearly is those documents have always regarded human rights as being revocable. They're conditional. They're just privileges that are doled out from the state to the people that can be revoked at any time. That's inherent in the language of the Charter of the UN and other UN documents and other UN protocols. Anyway, in terms of the Sustainable Development Political Declaration, this is from a UN press conference, or excuse me, press release. And this SDG Summit Political Declaration, going back to 2023, it gets into a lot of things. It says here the adoption of the 10-page document by the heads of state and government and high representatives gathered at the UN in New York back in 2023 in September of that year. That came at a critical juncture as global crises, including armed conflict, adverse climate impacts, and the lingering effects of the COVID-19 pandemic threaten the achievement, get that, threaten the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. And the Secretary General Antonio Guterres went on to say this, Brian, the Sustainable Development Goals need a global rescue plan. And he also noted that the Sustainable Development Goals are at their halfway point to their deadline. So there's some indication, as I mentioned earlier, that this is falling behind once again because it used to be called Agenda 2021, something like that. So they've had to move the goalposts several times. Now, the Rio Declaration that I mentioned just moments ago goes all the way back to 1992, as this slide shows, and that was known as the Earth Summit. And we mentioned that with regards to Stephen Rockefeller recently on the column. And moving on from there, we have a little bit more from Sabelo Sabanda, and he noted there are agencies run by people. He said this during the Children's Health Defense Program this past Wednesday. There are agencies run by people who have not been voted in by any one of us. And as he said that, he focused on Preamble 11 of the document I mentioned a few minutes ago, the Declaration of the Future. And Preamble 11 talks about to build a stronger, more effective, and resilient multilateral system with the United Nations at its core. And Sabelo took issue with this, showing or believing and explaining that is that he sees a lot of UN consolidation of power in the works, and he believes that plank of that declaration proves that. He went on to say, though, in a more reassuring tone, that the people are not well aware of how they've been empowered by their constitutions and their laws. So the US Constitution, other constitutions of other countries, he's saying the laws of other countries do provide some shield, some protection, but the people need to become more knowledgeable of how that works and what it consists of. And they need to work harder to become more informed about what the UN and the WHO are doing to consolidate their power to try and achieve these SDGs by 2030, even though they may be falling behind. So the other speaker I covered, Dr. Astrid Stuckelberger, she also has some UN affiliation, high-level international expert for United Nations agencies, bilateral institutions, and for the European Commission. She's an interdisciplinary scientist at the University of Geneva and Lausanne in Switzerland. And she asked the question, what's wrong with the Pact of the Future? Her answer to that question was it'll transform global governance and turbocharge the UN's Sustainable Development Goals toward a common digital future. And she said, yes, it's normal to have an annual September UN meeting, though she disagrees with the procedure and the content. And the media, of course, is a mouthpiece for the UN's one world governance and one world health, quote unquote. But what's not normal is that the loop of discussion is closed tighter than ever before. And she said the UN is, quote, violating its own instruments, end quote. We have not given consent. I repeat, we have not given consent to transfer power of our governments to the UN, nor for our governments to decide or to make their decisions at the UN. And she added there's a high-tech drive that the people have not accepted or consented to in high technology, including AI. And the people need to be enabled, she said, to opt out of this planned digital world. So those were the most salient points, I believe, Brian, of this past Wednesday's program. And it comes at a very timely moment to counter what the UN and WHO are doing today, right as these summits kick off. And so with that, I believe I have a couple of short announcements.
Mark, I just wanted to say there what wonderful observations by Sabelo Sabanda that he's pointing out that people need to wake up and understand the protections of their own constitution and constitutional structure. This is very, very important. And I believe you've just got a little extra segment here on smart cities.
Yeah, there's an AV program coming up next month. I believe it's on October 10th, where I'll be doing another presentation on smart cities and global cities. But we don't want to let these people rest for 1 second. We want to keep a very close eye on them very well ahead of time. So the Global Parliament of Mayors and the Smart City Expo World Congress are teaming up November 5 through 7 in Barcelona. This slide is from the Global Parliament of Mayors, and the next slide is from the Smart City Expo World Congress itself, the event for better cities, they claim, again, November 5 through 7 in Barcelona, Spain. And this will be included in my AV program. And when it actually comes up and happens, I'll be covering that as well, Brian. So back to you.
Okay. Mark, thank you very much for that analysis. Very good.